Okay, your second last show you know, or show you know 3 in section 4.2 says convert each percent to both a decimal, and a fraction. So the first one we're going to do is we're going to write 750%, and we're going to write it as 750 out of 100. Okay? So we're actually going to do the fraction first again, right? So because it's a percent, it's 750%, which means it's 750 out of 100, which is an improper fraction, which is equal to 7 and 50 hundredths. Okay, and that's the mixed fraction of it. So 750% is 750 over 100, which is equal to 7 and 50 hundredths. Now, if I wanted to reduce this to lowest terms, it would be 7.5, right? Just as a side note, if you're changing that percent to a lowest term fraction, it would be 7.5. And since we need to also go to a decimal, I want to read it as 7 and 50 hundredths, which is equal to 7 and 50 hundredths. Now, some of you might be saying, well, hang on, do we really need that other zero there? Is that something we need to have? The answer is no. And the reason why that zero is insignificant is because technically 7 and 50 hundredths is equivalent to 7 and 5 tenths, right? Or 7.5, but all three of those are the same thing as in decimal form. It's 7 decimal 5. Okay. For question B, 0.3% will be 0.3 out of 100. So when I look at 0.3%, since it's a percentage out of 100, and it's 0.3 out of 100. Now, when we're talking about putting it into fractions, we know that decimals and fractions are the same thing, but you can't have decimals as a part of your fraction. So because there is a decimal in this fraction, I have to figure out what can I multiply, what's the minimum number of times I have to move the decimal to get rid of the decimal. And that's 1 time, which means I just have to multiply both by 10 to create an equivalent fraction of 3 thousandths, right? And that's the better fraction version because it doesn't contain decimals. So 0.3% is 0.3 of 100. As an equivalent fraction, it's 3 over 1,000. And if I read this as 3 thousandths, and when I go to write it as a decimal, this is your tenths, that's your hundredths, and that's your thousandths, and so on and so forth. So if it's 3 thousandths, the 3 will go in your thousandths position, and in order to keep it out there, I need to put a couple zeros in here. So therefore, this number as a decimal is 0.003. So to recap, 0.3% as a fraction is 3 thousandths, and as a decimal is 0.003. And your last one, C, says 12.75%. So what we're going to first do is change this to a decimal. We don't want to have fractions within our percentages, so we're going to say is the same thing as 12 decimal what? What's 3/4 as a decimal? 7.5. So we're going to say that 12.75% is the same thing as 12.75%. And now that we have it written like that, we're off to the races. If we're talking about 12.75%, we're talking about 12.75 out of 100. Now remember we said that you can't have decimals in your fractions, but this time I have to move it twice to get rid of the decimals. So I'm going to multiply both terms by 100. That will give me an equivalent fraction of 12.75, no decimal, over 10,000. Right? Now I think 100 times 100 is 10,000. And then I read this as 1,275 10,000ths. Right? That's the fraction. And since this is the tenths, this is the hundredths, this is the thousandths, this one over here is your 10,000ths. So when I write my place value lines, this one right here is your 10,000ths, which means this numerator has to end there. So 5, 7, 2, 1. So 12.75% written as a decimal is 0.1275. That is 12.75% written as a decimal.